On the morning of December 6, 1907, 2 explosions occurred inside the Monongah mines in Marion County, West Virginia, within seconds of each other. The first explosion originated in mine number 6, the second, moments later, in mine number 8. The 2 mines shared a ventilation system and were connected underground, which meant that the force of the first explosion travelled through the connecting passages and ignited the accumulated gas and coal dust in the second mine before the men inside it had any warning that something had gone wrong in the mine next door. The official death toll was 362 men. It remains the deadliest mine disaster in American history. The actual death toll was higher. The company's payroll records did not account for the boys who worked underground illegally under the minimum age required by West Virginia law, whose presence in the mine on the morning of December 6th was known to the foremen and ignored because the work required them and the law that prohibited them was not enforced. When the rescuers went into the mine after the explosion, they found bodies that the official count did not fully account for. The best historical estimate, compiled by researchers who have cross-referenced the company's payroll records against the Marion County death registers and the Italian consular records for the immigrant families involved, puts the actual death toll at somewhere between 400 and 500 men and boys. The Fairmont Coal Company, which owned the Monongah mines, paid for the funerals of the confirmed dead. It provided no compensation to the families beyond the funeral payment. There was no legal requirement that it do so. West Virginia had no workers' compensation law in 1907. The federal government had no mine safety agency with enforcement authority. The men who went into the Monongah mines on December 6, 1907, had no legal protection that would have prevented the conditions that killed them, and their families had no legal recourse that would have compensated them for the loss. This is the story of how American coal miners worked and died underground before safety laws existed, and what the record shows about the gap between what the industry knew about mine safety and what it chose to do about it. The American coal mining industry expanded rapidly after the Civil War, driven by the fuel demands of the railroad network, the iron and steel industry, and the domestic heating market of the growing American cities. Coal production in the United States rose from roughly 30 million tons per year in 1870 to 400 million tons per year by 1910, a more than tenfold increase in 40 years. That expansion was built on the labour of men and boys who went underground in conditions that were understood, even at the time, to be extraordinarily dangerous. The hazards of coal mining were not mysteries to the industry or to the miners who worked in it. They were documented, studied, and discussed in trade publications and government reports throughout the period. The knowledge of what killed miners existed. The political will and the legal framework to act on that knowledge did not. The primary hazards of underground coal mining in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were 5. Roof falls, which killed more miners than any other single cause. Gas explosions, which produced the mass casualty events like Monongah. Coal dust explosions, which could be triggered by a gas explosion or by a spark from machinery or a miner's lamp. Flooding, which could trap miners underground when water broke through from abandoned adjacent workings. And black lung disease, which killed miners slowly over years rather than all at once, and which was therefore less visible in the statistics, but killed more men in aggregate than all the acute causes combined. Roof falls were the daily reality of underground coal work. A coal seam is a horizontal layer of coal compressed between layers of other rock, and mining it requires removing the coal while leaving the roof overhead intact, supported only by the pillars of coal that the miners chose not to remove, or by timber props that the miners themselves cut and placed. The stability of the roof depended on the geology of the overlying rock, the skill and judgment of the miners placing the supports, the quality of the timber available, and a degree of unpredictability in how fractured rock behaves that the miners of the period had no reliable way to assess. A roof fall could be a small event, a few tons of rock coming down in a section that had been worked recently, injuring 1 or 2 men who happened to be under it. It could be a large event, a section of roof giving way in a cascade that buried an entire working section under hundreds of tons of material before the men inside it could reach an exit. The United States Geological Survey compiled annual statistics on coal mine fatalities beginning in 1870, and the records from the period between 1870 and 1910 show consistent figures. Between 2 and 3 men killed per million tons of coal produced, with roof falls accounting for roughly half of all deaths, and explosions accounting for most of the remainder. In absolute numbers, This translated to between 1,500 and 3,000 miners killed per year in American coal mines throughout the period, with higher totals in the years when major explosions occurred. 3,000 miners per year, every year, for 40 years. The men who went into the mines were not ignorant of the risk. Mining communities in Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Kentucky and Illinois were communities in which every adult had direct experience with death underground. A miner who had worked for 15 years in the anthracite fields of eastern Pennsylvania had attended the funerals of colleagues and neighbours on multiple occasions, and had his own near misses stored in a personal inventory of moments when the roof had moved and he had moved faster. The risk was not hidden. It was the condition of the work, accepted because the alternative to mining was not working, and not working was not an option for the men and their families who depended on the wage. The wage for a coal miner in the 1880s and 1890s was not a fixed daily rate in most operations. It was a piece rate, paid per ton of coal produced. A miner who produced more coal earned more money. A miner who spent his shift dealing with a difficult section of roof or a bad seam that produced more slate than coal earned less, regardless of how many hours he worked. The piece rate system had consequences for safety that were understood at the time and documented in the reports of state mine inspectors. A miner paid by the ton had an economic incentive to spend his time cutting coal rather than setting props. A prop properly placed required time that was not being paid for. A prop skipped allowed the miner to cut another car of coal and add to his daily tally. The rooffall statistics reflected this incentive. The sections of mines with the most intensive production were consistently the sections with the highest rates of roof failure, because the miners working those sections were cutting as fast as they could and propping as little as they could get away with. State mine inspectors documented this pattern in their annual reports throughout the period. The Pennsylvania Bureau of Mines report for 1895, held in the Pennsylvania State Archives, contains a section on roof fall prevention that explicitly identifies the piece rate payment system as a contributing factor in roof fall casualties, noting that miners under production pressure systematically underpropped relative to the requirements of the roof conditions they were working in. The report recommends increased inspection frequency, and the authority for inspectors to order work stopped in sections with inadequate propping. It does not recommend changing the piece rate payment system, because changing the payment system was a matter for labour negotiation between miners and operators, not for the State Mine Inspection Bureau. The mine operators understood the piece rate system's effect on safety, as well as the inspectors did. The operators also understood that the piece rate system extracted maximum production from their workforce by aligning the miner's individual economic interest with the operator's production goals. A daily wage miner might slow down when he was tired or when the seam was difficult. A piece rate miner kept cutting because every ton he cut was money he would not have if he stopped. The calculation that the operators made was that the productivity gains from the piece rate system exceeded the costs associated with the higher injury and fatality rates it produced. In 1900, those costs were minimal. There was no workers' compensation. There was no meaningful legal liability for unsafe conditions in most states. The cost of a death in the mine was the cost of the funeral, which the companies sometimes paid as a gesture of goodwill, and the cost of recruiting a replacement worker, which in the labour markets of the coalfields was not a significant expense. The immigrant labour that filled the coalfields of Pennsylvania and West Virginia from the 1880s onward was available in quantities that made individual workers economically replaceable. A miner killed in a roof fall in a Fayette County, Pennsylvania colliery in 1895 was replaced by the next man in line at the company employment office, who might be from Poland or Italy or Slovakia or Hungary, and who had come to America for work and was willing to go underground because the coal companies were hiring and the alternatives were limited. The Monongah miners were predominantly Italian immigrants, many of them from the villages of southern Italy and Sicily, recruited by labour agents who had told them that America had work and that the work paid. The payroll records of the Fairmont Coal Company show Italian surnames dominating the workforce of Mines 6 and 8 in December of 1907, with smaller numbers of workers from other immigrant communities. The Italian consulate in Pittsburgh maintained records of the Italian nationals killed in the Monongah explosion, because the consulate had a responsibility to notify the families in Italy of the deaths of their husbands and sons. Those records, which were eventually deposited in the Italian diplomatic archives, contain information about the men that the American company records do not: their home villages, their ages, the names of the family members they had left behind, the amounts of money they had been sending home. One entry in the consular records is for a man named Valentino Valentini, 31 years old, from the village of Mora de Sanctis in the province of Avellino in Campania. He had arrived in the United States in 1904 and had been working in the Monongah mines for approximately 2 years at the time of the explosion. He had a wife and 2 children in Mora de Sanctis. He had been sending a portion of his wages home each month. The consular record does not indicate how much he had been sending. The Fairmont Coal Company payroll for November 1907, the last payroll before the explosion, shows a Valentino Valentini earning wages consistent with approximately 12 to 14 days of work at the standard piece rate for his section of the mine, which would have put his monthly earnings at between $20 and $25. His wife and children in Mora de Sanctis received notification of his death from the Italian consulate. They received no compensation from the Fairmont Coal Company. West Virginia had no workers' compensation law. The Italian government had no treaty with the United States that would have provided a mechanism for compensating the families of Italian nationals killed in American workplace accidents. The children of Valentino Valentini grew up in Mora de Sanctis without their father and without the income he had been sending. What happened to them after that is not in any archive that the research on the Monongah disaster has identified. The gas explosion that killed Valentini and 361 other confirmed men was not an unforeseeable event. Gas explosions in coal mines were a known hazard, understood in their mechanism, and preventable through methods that were also known. The prevention required adequate ventilation to dilute the methane that accumulated in coal seams as coal was mined, and it required either flame-safe lamps that could not ignite accumulated gas, or adequate testing for gas before lamps were carried into sections where gas had accumulated. The Monongah mines used open flame carbide lamps in December of 1907. A carbide lamp burns a small flame produced by the reaction of calcium carbide with water, and it produces an open flame that will ignite an explosive mixture of methane and air if it encounters one. The alternative, the flame-safe Davy lamp that had been developed in England in 1815 specifically to prevent gas ignitions in mines, was available and in use in some American mines by 1907. It was not in use at Monongah. The reason it was not in use was that the Davy lamp produces less light than a carbide lamp, which slows production, and slower production meant less coal per man per day, and less revenue for the company and less pay for the miners. The miners themselves often preferred the carbide lamp because it allowed them to work faster and earn more under the piece rate system. The economic incentives of the piece rate system operated against the adoption of the safer lamp at both the operator and miner level simultaneously. The mine inspector reports for the years before Monongah document the accumulation of gas in sections of Mines 6 and 8. The West Virginia Department of Mines report for 1906, held in the West Virginia State Archives, notes gas accumulations in the Monongah area mines and recommends improved ventilation. The recommendation was not enforced because the West Virginia Mine Inspection System in 1906 had 11 inspectors for the entire state's coal industry and no authority to shut down a mine for safety violations without a court order that could take months to obtain. 11 inspectors for the entire state, in a state that was producing approximately 70 million tons of coal per year in 1906. The Federal Bureau of Mines was established in 1910, 3 years after Monongah, partly in direct response to the disaster and the public attention it generated. The Bureau was established with a mandate to research mine safety and to investigate mine accidents. It was not given enforcement authority. It could study the problems. It could not close a mine for safety violations. Enforcement authority over federal mine safety did not come until the Federal Coal Mine Safety Act of 1952, 45 years after Monongah. The Comprehensive Mine Safety and Health Act, which established the regulatory framework that modern American mines operate under, was passed in 1977, 70 years after 362 men died in Marion County, West Virginia. In those 70 years, American coal mines killed approximately 100,000 workers. The men who went into the mines in the decades between Monongah and the Mine Safety and Health Act were going into conditions that were better than those of 1907, but that remained substantially more dangerous than any comparable industrial work in a country with adequate regulatory oversight would have tolerated. The black lung disease statistics illustrate the long-term character of the cost in a way that the explosion statistics do not. Black lung, formerly called coal workers' pneumoconiosis, is caused by the inhalation of coal dust over years of underground work. the dust accumulates in the lung tissue and eventually causes progressive, irreversible scarring that reduces lung capacity and leads to death from respiratory failure. The disease takes 10 to 30 years to develop from initial exposure to symptomatic impairment, which means that a miner who started working underground at 16 would typically not show significant symptoms until his 40s or 50s, and would die from the disease in his 50s or 60s. The disease was known by the name miner's asthma or black spit throughout the period of coal's industrial expansion. Miners knew what it meant when a colleague's cough changed character, when the sputum turned black, when a man who had worked underground for 20 years could no longer climb the steps to the mine entrance without stopping to rest. It was accepted as an occupational inevitability in the way that the roof fall risk was accepted because the alternative was not working. The medical community's understanding of black lung was limited through most of the period. The British medical literature had documented coal workers' lung disease since the 1830s, but the American medical establishment was slow to accept the diagnosis as a distinct entity and continued to attribute miners' respiratory problems to tuberculosis or other conditions well into the 20th century. The coal operators had an interest in the ambiguity. A miner whose respiratory impairment was attributed to tuberculosis or to individual constitutional weakness had no claim against his employer. A miner whose impairment was attributed to coal dust exposure in the mine had a potential claim, and the operators worked through their industry associations and through their influence on state medical boards to resist the formal recognition of black lung as an occupational disease. The Black Lung Compensation Program in the United States was not established until 1969, under the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of that year. By that point, the disease had been killing American coal miners for a century and had been understood as a coal dust-related condition by European occupational medicine for decades. The men who died of black lung between 1870 and 1969, and who died without compensation for a condition caused directly by their work, are not in any single compilation. The disease killed gradually and often at home, in the mining communities of Appalachia and the Midwest, in the years after a man left the mine, and the death records attributed to respiratory causes across these communities represent a toll that is large and that no comprehensive historical accounting has fully captured. The best estimates in the occupational health literature suggest that black lung killed between 60 and 100,000 American coal miners in the century between 1870 and 1969. The number who were compensated for the disease during that period was close to zero because the legal and medical framework for compensation did not exist. They went into the mines, the dust accumulated. They came out, eventually, when their bodies would no longer let them stay. They died at home, slowly, in the mining communities where their working lives had been spent, and the communities buried them and went on. The communities that grew up around the coal mines of Appalachia and the Midwest in the late 19th and early 20th century were not simply labour markets. They were complete social worlds, organised around the mine and the company that operated it, with housing and stores and churches and schools, all provided by or controlled by the company in many cases. The company town was the dominant form of social organisation in the coalfields through the period of maximum expansion from roughly 1880 to 1920. The company owned the houses that the miners rented. The company operated the store where the miners bought their food and supplies, often paying wages partially in scrip that could only be used at the company store. The company provided the church building, which meant the company had leverage over the minister. The company controlled access to the housing, which meant that a miner who was fired or who went on strike lost his house as well as his job. The leverage that this system gave the company over its workforce was total in the most isolated mining communities, where there was no alternative employer within practical distance, and no way to leave the community without the means to relocate, that the scrip wage system systematically prevented workers from accumulating. The Cabin Creek and Paint Creek mining districts of Kanawha County, West Virginia, operated under this system in the first decade of the 20th century, and the conditions in those districts produced one of the most significant labour conflicts in American history, the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike of 1912 to 1913. The strike began in April of 1912, when the miners of the Paint Creek mines walked out over the refusal of the operators to recognize the United Mine Workers of America and to improve wages and working conditions. The operators responded by evicting striking miners from company housing and hiring armed guards, known as the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, to protect the mines and the replacement workers brought in to operate them. The conflict that followed over the next year and a half included armed confrontations between miners and guards, the declaration of martial law by the governor of West Virginia on 2 separate occasions, the trial of striking miners by military tribunals, and the appearance of Mary Harris Jones, known universally as Mother Jones, who at the age of 76 organized and addressed miners' meetings throughout the district and was herself arrested and tried by military tribunal. The strike ended in 1913 with a negotiated settlement that provided some of what the miners had demanded, including the right to trade at stores other than the company store and some improvements in wages. It did not establish union recognition in most of the struck mines, and it did not change the fundamental conditions of work in the mines. The roof falls continued, the gas accumulated, the dust settled in the lungs of the men who went back underground. 3 years after the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike ended, another West Virginia mine disaster killed 112 men at the Leyland mine in Fayette County in March of 1915. The cause was a gas explosion. The conditions that produced the gas accumulation were the same conditions that mine inspectors had been documenting and recommending action on for years. The record of what was known and what was not done with that knowledge runs through the entire history of American coal mine safety, from the 1870s to the 1970s, and it is one of the clearer examples in American industrial history of the gap between technical knowledge and regulatory action. The knowledge of how to ventilate a coal mine to prevent gas accumulation was not a secret in 1907. The knowledge of how to suppress coal dust with water or limestone dust to prevent secondary explosions was not a secret. The knowledge that open-flame carbide lamps ignited gas was not a secret. The knowledge that the piece rate payment system created incentives for inadequate roof support was not a secret. All of this was in the annual reports of the state mine inspection bureaus, in the publications of the American Institute of Mining Engineers, in the reports of the Bureau of Mines after its establishment in 1910. The information was available. What was not available, until the regulatory framework was finally built, was the enforcement mechanism that would have required operators to act on the information. Knowledge without enforcement is a recommendation, and the coal operators of the period had no incentive to follow recommendations that cost money and reduced production. The enforcement came, eventually 70 years after Monongah, in the form of the Mine Safety and Health Act of 1977 and the agency it created. The men who died in the intervening 70 years, in the explosions and the roof falls and the black lung wards of Appalachian hospitals, are in the county death registers of West Virginia and Pennsylvania and Kentucky and Illinois, and in the records of the United Mine Workers of America Death Benefit Fund, and in the records of the Italian consulate in Pittsburgh, and the Polish consulate in New York, and the Slovak consulate in Pittsburgh, where the immigrant families of the early 20th century miners are documented in the way that the American company records did not document them. Valentino Valentini's children grew up in Mora de Sanctis without him. The village is still there in the mountains of Campania, about an hour's drive from Naples. It had a population of several thousand at the turn of the century, and has a few hundred residents today, most of them elderly. The emigration that sent Valentino Valentini to the Monongah mines in 1904 eventually took most of the village's young men to America, and the ones who survived came back, or sent for their families, or stayed and became Americans. Valentino Valentini did not come back. He is in the Italian consular records, in the Marion County death register, and in the payroll records of the Fairmont Coal Company for November 1907, the last month he worked. His last paycheck was for approximately $20. It was not paid to him. It would have been paid to whoever presented his work records at the company office, if anyone did. The Monongah mine site in Marion County, West Virginia is now the location of a small memorial. A historical marker on the roadside notes the date of the disaster and the confirmed death toll of 362. The mines themselves were sealed and have not been operated since the early 20th century. The coal seams that Valentino Valentini and the men who worked alongside him were cutting on the morning of December the 6th, 1907, are still there, underground, in the dark, under the same hills that have been there since long before the first mine shaft was sunk. The men are in the records. The coal is in the ground. 362 is the number that the marker gives, the number that the Italian consular records and the Marion County death register and the cross-referenced payroll books suggest is higher. How much higher is the gap between what was counted and what actually happened, which is the gap that runs through the entire history of American mine safety before the laws existed to close it? The daily work of a coal miner in the late 19th century is worth understanding at the level of what a man actually did when he went underground, because the abstract statistics of deaths per million tons do not convey what those deaths interrupted. A miner in the bituminous coal fields of western Pennsylvania or West Virginia in 1895 began his workday at the mine mouth, where he collected his lamp and his tools from the lamp house and the tool crib. He walked or rode a mine car to his working section, which might be a quarter mile or a half mile from the mine entrance through the main haulage way. At his section, he checked the roof before doing anything else, tapping the rock with a wooden handle and listening for the hollow sound that indicated the roof had separated from the overlying strata and was ready to fall. The tapping test was the primary roof inspection method available to a miner of the period. A solid tap produced a sharp sound. A hollow tap, called a drummer, indicated a section of roof that was unsupported and could fall without further warning. A miner who found a drummer reported it to the mine foreman, who would decide whether the section needed propping before work resumed, or whether production pressure required the miner to work under it, while propping was being arranged. The decision was usually made by the foreman, not the miner, and the foreman was under the same production pressure that the piece rate system created at every level of the mine organisation. A foreman who consistently shut down sections for safety reasons was a foreman who was not making his production quota, and a foreman who did not make his production quota did not remain a foreman. The miner who went to work under a drumming roof was not doing so because he did not know it was dangerous. He was doing so because the foreman had told him to continue, and because refusing a direct order from the foreman meant risking his employment, and risking his employment meant risking his family's income, and his family's income was dependent on the piece rate wages he earned in that section. After checking the roof, the miner began undercutting the coal seam. The seam was typically a horizontal layer of coal between 3 and 7 feet thick, sandwiched between layers of rock. To bring the coal down, the miner had to cut beneath it first, removing a horizontal slice of material from the bottom of the seam to create a space into which the coal above would fall when he blasted it. The undercutting was done lying on one side, using a pick to chop at the base of the seam in a horizontal motion. In a 3-foot seam, there was not enough room to swing a pick normally, and the miner worked in a space barely large enough to fit his body, in a posture that put continuous strain on his spine and shoulders. The undercutting for a typical shot, the explosive charge that would bring down the coal, required cutting a slot approximately 6 feet wide and 2 to 3 feet deep into the base of the seam, which took between 1 and 2 hours of continuous work in that confined position. After undercutting, the miner drilled the shot holes, loaded the explosive charge, placed the fuse, and retreated to a safe position before firing. The shot brought down a section of the undercut coal, which the miner then loaded into cars by hand, shoveling the broken coal into the mine car while sorting out the slate and rock that came down with it. He was paid only for the coal, not for the slate, which meant that slate mixed in with his coal reduced his tonnage count and therefore his pay. Loading was the most physically demanding part of the job. A miner who had spent the morning undercutting and drilling spent the afternoon shoveling tons of coal into cars, bent over in the low headroom of the working section, in a space lit by a single carbide lamp. The carbide lamp produced enough light to work by, and enough heat to make the confined space warmer than it needed to be. It also produced the flame that would ignite any methane that accumulated in the working section if the concentration reached explosive levels. The miner knew this. He also knew that his alternative, the Davy safety lamp, produced less light and made the already difficult work harder. He used the carbide lamp because it let him work faster, and working faster meant more coal, and more coal meant more pay. The methane that accumulated in coal seams seeped continuously from the coal as it was cut. In sections with good ventilation, the methane was diluted and carried away before it could reach explosive concentration. In sections with inadequate ventilation, or in sections where the ventilation system had been compromised by a fall or a door left open in the haulage way, the methane could reach explosive concentration without the miner knowing, because methane is colourless and odourless, and the carbide lamp did not change its behaviour at concentrations below the explosive threshold. The explosive threshold for methane in air is between 5 and 15% by volume. Below 5% the mixture will not ignite. Above 15% it will not ignite either, because there is not enough oxygen to support combustion. Between 5 and 15%, a spark or a flame will ignite it. The miner's carbide lamp was a continuous ignition source, burning throughout the working day. This is the mechanism that killed the men at Monongah. the methane accumulated in sections of mines 6 and 8 that the ventilation system was not moving air through adequately. When the concentration reached the explosive range, a spark or a lamp flame ignited it. The explosion propagated through the mine, igniting the coal dust that had accumulated on the floor and walls and supports of the working sections, turning a gas explosion into a coal dust explosion that travelled through the connected workings with a force that no man inside could survive. The bodies of the men killed at Monongah were not all recovered immediately. The explosion and the subsequent fires and afterdamp, the toxic atmosphere of carbon monoxide and other gases that followed the explosion, made immediate rescue operations impossible. The rescue crews that went in after the explosions had no breathing apparatus, because self-contained breathing apparatus for mine rescue did not exist as standard equipment in American mines in 1907. The rescuers carried canaries, the traditional method of detecting carbon monoxide, and retreated when the canary showed signs of distress. The last bodies from the Monongah explosion were recovered weeks after the event. Some sections of the mine were never fully cleared, and it is possible that some remains were never recovered. The official count of 362 may undercount the dead not only because of the illegal child labour, but because some of the dead were never found. The rescue effort at Monongah, conducted by men without breathing apparatus in the aftermath of an explosion that had left the mine full of toxic gas, resulted in additional casualties among the rescuers. The number of rescuers injured or killed is not prominently featured in the official accounts of the disaster, because the rescuers' willingness to go into conditions that had already killed several hundred men was considered admirable, rather than a reflection of the absence of adequate rescue equipment. The Bureau of Mines, established 3 years after Monongah, developed mine rescue training and equipment as one of its first priorities. The mine rescue cars, specially equipped railroad cars that carried breathing apparatus and rescue equipment, and could be dispatched to mine disaster sites, were among the Bureau's earliest programs. They were in service by 1912. They were not available in December of 1907. The union that represented many American coal miners in the early 20th century, the United Mine Workers of America, had been organizing in the West Virginia coalfields for years before Monongah and continued after it. The UMA's position on mine safety was clear. It required union recognition, which would give miners the collective leverage to resist pressure to work in unsafe conditions, and it required state and federal legislation with enforcement authority. The union got neither in West Virginia in the immediate aftermath of Monongah. The state legislature passed a mine safety law in 1908 that increased the number of mine inspectors and required additional safety measures, but the law was opposed by the operators and was funded at a level that made enforcement difficult. The operators who had been running mines 6 and 8 in December of 1907 were not prosecuted for the conditions that produced the explosion. The Fairmont Coal Company continued to operate its other mines in Marion County after Monongah. The company was eventually absorbed into the Consolidated Coal Company, which became one of the largest coal producers in the United States. The corporate lineage that traces from the Fairmont Coal Company of 1907 runs through a series of mergers and acquisitions to companies that were still producing coal in West Virginia decades later. No one was held legally responsible for the deaths of Valentino Valentini and 361 other confirmed men in the Monongah mines on December 6, 1907. The knowledge that the conditions in those mines were dangerous, documented in the inspection reports of the West Virginia Department of Mines in the years before the explosion, was available to anyone who read the reports. The reports were public documents. The recommendations in those reports for improved ventilation and better lamp equipment and more frequent inspection were not acted on in the years before December 6, 1907. The gap between what was known and what was done is the central fact of the Monongah disaster, and it is the central fact of American mine safety in the period between the industry's expansion, after the Civil War, and the regulatory framework that finally gave enforcement authority to the knowledge that had been accumulating for decades. The miners who went underground every day in the 40 years between the industry's expansion and the Monongah disaster went underground knowing that the roof might fall, that the gas might accumulate, that the dust might ignite, and that if any of these things happened, there was no legal protection that would have prevented the conditions that produced them, and no compensation system that would sustain their families if they did not come back out. They went because the work paid. They went because not working was worse. They went because the coal fields were where they were and the work was what there was. The roof fell on some of them, The gas ignited for others. The dust settled in the lungs of nearly all of them and killed a portion of them slowly in the years after they left the mines. The ones who survived to old age, who were sitting in the mining communities of West Virginia and Pennsylvania in the 1960s when the Black Lung movement finally forced the compensation program into law, had spent 50 years watching the disease that was killing them be officially denied. They knew what it was. They had always known what it was. They called it black spit and miner's asthma, and they watched it take the men who'd worked alongside them, and they coughed the same cough themselves, and knew what the cough meant. The compensation program that was established in 1969 came too late for the men who had already died from it. It came in time for some of the men who were still alive, who received the modest monthly payments that the program provided in the years before they died. The Monongah Memorial in Marion County, West Virginia, marks the disaster with a date and a number. December 6, 1907. 362. The number on the marker is the number the company counted. The number in the Italian consular records is higher. The number that includes the children who were underground illegally that morning is higher still. And the number that includes the men who survived December 6th and died of black lung in the following decades in the mining communities of West Virginia is a number that no marker in Marion County records. They are in the county death registers under respiratory causes in the years between 1920 and 1970. They went into the mines. The dust went with them. It stayed. The children who worked in American coal mines in the late 19th and early 20th century were not a small or marginal part of the workforce. They were a structural element of the industry's labour system, present in large numbers, performing work that the mines depended on, and protected by laws that were inadequate, inconsistently enforced and systematically evaded by operators who needed their labour, and by families who needed the income. The primary job for boys in the mines was the breaker. The breaker was a large wooden building at the surface, above the mine entrance, where the coal brought up from underground was sorted, cleaned of slate and rock, and sized for different markets. The breaker boys, who ranged in age from 7 to 15, sat at chutes through which the coal flowed, picking out the slate and rock by hand as the coal passed under their hands. They worked bent over the chute for 10 hours a day, in a building that was perpetually dusty with coal dust, breathing the same dust that would eventually produce black lung in the miners' underground. The work was not glamorous, but it was also not supposed to be underground. The minimum age laws of the period, where they existed, typically set 14 or 16 as the minimum age for underground work. The breaker was considered surface work and was sometimes exempt from the age minimum, which is why the youngest children were in the breaker rather than in the mine itself. The child workers in the Monongah explosion were the exceptions to this pattern, boys who had been taken underground on December 6, 1907, in violation of the West Virginia minimum age law, either because their fathers or older brothers had brought them in informally, or because the supervisors had looked the other way when they came through the mine entrance. The precise mechanism by which each individual boy came to be underground on that morning is not documented, because the company had no incentive to document the presence of children in the mine and every incentive not to. Lewis Hine, the photographer who documented child labour conditions in American industry for the National Child Labour Committee between 1908 and 1918, photographed the breaker boys of the Pennsylvania anthracite fields in 1910 and 1911. His photographs, which are held at the Library of Congress, show boys as young as 9 or 10 sitting at the breaker chutes, their faces and hands blackened with coal dust, their expressions ranging from bored to exhausted. The photographs were used by the National Child Labour Committee in its lobbying for federal child labour legislation, and they are among the most cited documentary images of American labour conditions in the Progressive era. Hine was a sociologist and a photographer who understood that images could carry arguments that statistics could not, and his breaker boy photographs made the abstract numbers of child labour legislation debates into specific faces. One of the photographs shows a boy identified in Hine's notes as Vance, age 12, a trapper boy at a mine in Bessemer City, North Carolina, photographed in 1908. A trapper boy's job was to open and close the ventilation doors that controlled airflow through the mine, sitting alone in the dark in the haulage way, opening the door when a mine car approached and closing it after the car passed. He sat there for his entire shift, in the dark, because the ventilation doors had to remain closed when no car was passing in order to maintain the airflow, and a lamp left burning in the closed section was a lamp that consumed the oxygen the ventilation system was supposed to be maintaining. Vance, age 12, in the dark, opening and closing a door in a North Carolina coal mine in 1908. His last name is not in Hine's notes. The mine where he worked is identified by county. What happened to him after Hine photographed him is not known. The Keating-Owen Child Labour Act, which established federal minimum age requirements for employment in industries producing goods for interstate commerce, was passed by Congress in 1916 and signed by Woodrow Wilson. It was the first federal child labour law. It was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1918 as an unconstitutional regulation of intrastate commerce. A second child labour law was passed and was also struck down. Federal child labour standards were not established on a permanent constitutional footing until the Fair Labour Standards Act of 1938. In the 30 years between Hine's photographs of the Breaker Boys and the Fair Labour Standards Act, the children of American coal mining families continued to work in the breakers and in the more isolated and less inspected operations underground. The men who ran the mining operations during this period were not uniformly indifferent to the conditions of their workers. There were individual operators who invested in safety equipment and maintained better ventilation than the minimum required, who enforced age limits and who paid their workers in cash rather than scrip. These operators existed, and their operations had better safety records than the industry average. They also had a competitive disadvantage relative to operators who did not make those investments, because the investments cost money that reduced profit margins, and the coal market of the period was highly competitive. A company that spent more on safety and less on production was a company that could be undercut on price by a company that spent less on safety and more on production, and in a commodity market, price was what determined which company got the contracts. This is the structural problem that the regulatory framework eventually solved, by establishing a floor below which no operator could go regardless of competitive pressure. A safety requirement that applied uniformly to all operators removed the competitive disadvantage of the operators who would have invested in safety voluntarily, and made the investment mandatory for the operators who would not have made it otherwise. The argument for the regulatory flaw was made repeatedly in the years before it was established, by the United Mine Workers and by the mine safety advocates in the Bureau of Mines and by the state inspection bureaus. The argument was correct as a matter of industrial economics. It took 70 years for Monongah to be fully implemented. In those 70 years, the mines continued to operate under conditions that were improving, gradually, as voluntary adoption of better practices spread and as state legislation was strengthened incrementally. But the improvement was uneven, and the events that drove it were primarily disasters, because disasters generated public attention and political pressure that gradual background mortality did not. The Cherry Mine disaster in Illinois in 1909, which killed 259 men, came 2 years after Monongah and added momentum to the push for the Bureau of Mines. The Eccles Mine disaster in West Virginia in 1914, which killed 183 men, renewed the pressure. The Hawk's Nest Tunnel disaster in West Virginia in the early 1930s, which killed between 400 and 764 workers from silicosis contracted during tunnel construction, was covered by a congressional investigation that documented the conditions with unusual thoroughness, and that demonstrated, again, the gap between what was known about occupational lung disease and what was being done about it. Each disaster produced a period of heightened attention, some legislative response, and then a gradual return to the background condition of mines that were safer than they had been before the disaster, but not as safe as the knowledge available would have allowed them to be. The miners who worked in the intervals between the disasters, who went underground every day in the mines that did not explode and that were not the subject of congressional investigations, are the men whose experience most fully represents what coal mining was before the safety laws existed. They are in the payroll records and in the black lung statistics, and in the obituaries of the mining community newspapers that covered the deaths from disease that did not make the front page. Their work built the industrial economy of the United States in the period of its maximum expansion. The coal they mined heated the homes and powered the factories and moved the trains that carried the goods that made the country what it was by 1920. The steel that built the Brooklyn Bridge and the transcontinental railroads and the skyscrapers of Chicago and New York was smelted in furnaces that burned coal that men like Valentino Valentini had cut from the seams of West Virginia. The coal is what the country was built on. The men who cut it are in the records of the companies that hired them, and the counties where they died, and the consulates that notified their families when they did not come home. Valentino Valentini's last paycheck was approximately $20. The mine that paid it opened on December 6, 1907, and 362 confirmed men did not come out of it. The coal seams under Monongah are still there. The men are in the records. The number on the marker is 362. The actual number is higher. How much higher is the gap that the records do not fully close? The mining communities that grew around the coal operations of Appalachia and the Midwest did not simply disappear when the mines closed. They contracted, shrank, and in many cases became the hollowed-out communities that American journalism has documented repeatedly over the past 50 years as examples of post-industrial decline. The connection between the conditions under which those communities were built and the conditions in which they exist today is direct and documented. The company town model, which gave the operator total control over the workers' housing, retail access, and social institutions, extracted the maximum possible economic value from the workers and from the region, while investing the minimum possible in the long-term economic development of either. When the coal ran out or became uneconomical to mine, the company left. The community remained, with a workforce trained for a single industry, in a region where that industry was declining, in towns built around infrastructure that the company had provided and that the community now had to maintain without the company's resources. The black lung disease that was still killing miners in those communities decades after the mines had reduced operations was not a historical artifact. It was an ongoing medical crisis that the communities managed with the compensation program established in 1969 and with the Appalachian Regional Commission programs and with the hospital systems that served the region, most of which were themselves products of the period when the coal industry was at its peak and had invested in regional infrastructure as a way of maintaining its workforce. The men who were receiving black lung compensation in the 1970s and 1980s were men who had started working in the mines in the 1930s and 1940s, when the regulatory framework was still developing and when coal dust suppression was still inconsistent. They were the last cohort of miners who had worked under conditions that the Mine Safety and Health Act of 1977 would have prohibited, and their lungs carried the record of those conditions in the scarring that the disease produces. Some of them had been children in the breakers before they were old enough for underground work. Some of them were the sons of men who had died at Monongah, or at Cherry, or at Eccles, or at any of the other disasters whose names appear in the history of American mine safety. Some of them were the grandsons of men who had come from Italy or Poland or Slovakia or Hungary and gone underground in the first years of the 20th century, in mines that had no safety inspectors with enforcement authority and no compensation system for the families of the dead. The inheritance ran through the families and through the communities in ways that are visible in the public health statistics of Appalachian West Virginia and eastern Kentucky and western Pennsylvania even today. The rates of respiratory disease in those communities are higher than the national average by margins that reflect both the legacy of coal dust exposure in the men who worked before the regulations existed and the ongoing environmental conditions in regions where coal mining and coal processing have been conducted for a century. The history of American coal mine safety before the laws existed is not a closed chapter. It is a chapter whose consequences are still being paid in the respiratory clinics of Appalachian hospitals and in the social security disability rolls, and in the obituaries of men in their 80s and 90s who spent their working lives underground, and whose lungs recorded what they breathed there. The Monongah Memorial marks December 6, 1907. It gives the number that the company counted. The Italian consular records in Pittsburgh give a different number, higher, for the Italian nationals alone. The Marion County death register gives a number that includes some of the men the company did not count. None of the numbers gives the full count of what the Monongah mines cost, because the full count includes the men who survived December 6th and died of black lung in the years and decades that followed in the mining communities of West Virginia without compensation for a disease caused directly by the work they had done. The count of those men is in the county death registers under respiratory causes across the decades between the disaster and the compensation program. Nobody has added it up in a way that produces a single number anyone has put on a marker. The mines at Monongah are sealed. The coal seams are still there, in the dark, under the hills of Marion County. The men are in the records. The full number is in the gap between the records and the reality that produced them. That gap is where most of this history lives. It is where the history of American coal mining before safety laws existed lives too, in the gap, in the records that survived, in the records that did not. In the dark under Marion County, West Virginia, where the coal seams have not moved since December 6, 1907, and will not move until someone decides to mine them again, or until they do not do.